The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic, rhythmic drone against the biting November wind that whipped across the stubble fields of the Miller farm. It was a liquidation sale, the saddest kind. Old man Miller had held on as long as he could, but a bad heart and 2 worse harvests had finally broken him. Now his life's work was being scattered to the 4 winds, sold piece by piece to his neighbors. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn canvas jacket, my breath pluming white in the cold air. I wasn't here for much, maybe a set of wrenches if they went cheap, or a spare hydraulic cylinder. I had what I needed back at my place, all of it paid for, none of it new. That's when they dragged it out. It was a beast, a hulking monument to a bygone era of brute force. A versatile 145, the first generation of the big 4-wheel drives. Its red paint was faded to a dull, chalky pink, streaked with years of rust bleeding from every bolt and seam. The massive tires were cracked and weather-checked, one of them alarmingly low. The twin chrome exhaust stacks were pitted and stained, and the simple open-air operator's station looked like a place a man went for punishment, not for work. A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of pity and amusement. Richard Sterling, who was standing near the front holding court as usual, let out a loud laugh. "Look at that old relic," he boomed, making sure everyone could hear. "Miller must have dragged that out of a scrapyard. Probably doesn't even run." Rich was the golden boy of the county. He'd taken over his father's operation 5 years back, and in that time he'd mortgaged it to the hilt to buy the newest, biggest, and shiniest of everything. He'd just taken delivery of a brand-new International Harvester 1466, a beautiful machine with a gleaming white cab and a turbo that screamed like a banshee. He farmed 1,000 acres and acted like he owned the whole county. He looked at my 80-bushel-an-acre corn yields from my old John Deere 4020 and Gleaner E combine with open contempt. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson, climbed up onto the drawbar of the old Versatile. "All right, folks, what we have here is a real piece of history. A 4-wheel drive Versatile. She's got a Cummins under the hood, and Mr. Miller swore to me she was running when he parked her last spring. Needs a little love, sure, but think of the pulling power here. Who'll start the bidding at $5,000? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the lane. 5,000 was a joke. You could buy a decent late-model 2-wheel drive for that. 4,000, Henderson pleaded. "Come on, boys, the engine alone is worth that." More silence. Rich Sterling smirked, turning to his buddies. "Henderson will be paying someone to haul that thing away." I watched the old tractor. I saw past the rust and the faded paint. I saw the massive planetary hubs, the heavy-duty frame, the simple mechanical linkage. There were no fancy electronics to fail, no complicated hydraulic systems that required a dealer mechanic and a second mortgage to fix. Underneath all that grime was a straight-six Cummins diesel, one of the most reliable engines ever built. It was a simple, honest machine built for one thing: pulling. And I had 160 acres of heavy clay that my 4020 struggled with every spring. $1,000, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the cold air. Every head turned to look at me. Rich Sterling's smirk widened into a grin of disbelief. Jedediah Stone, I should have known, always looking for a bargain. "You gonna pull that home with your Farmall M?" A few men chuckled. I ignored them. My eyes were locked on Henderson. He looked disappointed, but took the bid. "I've got 1,000 from Mr. Stone. Do I hear 1,500? He looked hopefully at the crowd. No one moved. They all saw what Rich saw, a pile of junk. They didn't see the potential. They didn't see a winter project that could save me days of work in the spring. "Going once at 1,000, Henderson called out, his voice losing its energy. "Going twice." I felt a knot in my stomach. I could afford it. It was cash from the coffee can I kept buried in the machine shed. It was a risk, but it was my risk. No banker involved. "Sold," Henderson's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "For $1,000 to Jedediah Stone." As the crowd began to disperse, moving on to a set of disc harrows, Rich Sterling made a point of walking over to me. He was flanked by 2 other farmers who were also deep in debt to the bank for new equipment. "Jed, you never cease to amaze me," Rich said, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh. What in God's name are you going to do with that thing? You'll spend more on parts than you paid for it, and it'll still break down in the middle of your first pass. It's a good engine, Rich, I said, my gaze still on the tractor. A good engine in a worthless chassis, he countered. Look, I'm trying to help you. The bank is offering fantastic financing right now. You could trade in that old 4020, get yourself a new 1066, maybe even a six-bottom plow. Start farming in the modern era. You can't make a living with museum pieces. I make a living just fine, I said evenly. And I sleep at night because I don't owe the bank a dime. Rich laughed, a sharp, barking sound. You call that a living, scrimping and saving, patching together junk? I'm going to clear $60,000 this year, Jed. 60,000. How much are you going to clear after you get this rust bucket running? He didn't wait for an answer. He just clapped me on the shoulder in a condescending way and walked off, his friends trailing behind him like pilot fish on a shark. I watched him go, the confident stride of a man who believed he had the world by the tail. I walked up to my new purchase. The tires were even bigger up close. I put my hand on the cold steel of the fender. It was solid. There was no rot, just surface rust. It was an ugly, forgotten thing, but it was mine. Every bolt, every gear, every flake of peeling paint belonged to me, not to a man in a suit at the Farmers Trust Bank. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Down in the comments, let me know. Have you ever bought something old and worn out that everyone else thought was junk? Because you could see the hidden value in it. It could be a tool, a car, a piece of furniture. I want to hear about it, because that's the heart of this whole thing. It's about seeing what others don't. I spent the rest of the afternoon arranging for a flatbed to haul the Versatile back to my farm. It cost me another $50 I hadn't planned on, but there was no way it was going to make the 5-mile trip under its own power. When it finally arrived, backing down my long gravel lane, it looked even more forlorn sitting next to my neat, well-kept machine shed. It was an eyesore, a declaration of poverty in a time of booming agricultural prosperity. My wife, Sarah, came out onto the back porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the tractor, then at me, and I could see the worry in her eyes. "Jed, what is that?" she asked, her voice tight. "It's a 4-wheel drive, Sarah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Got it for a song. It'll help with the spring plowing, take a load off the 4020. "It looks like it belongs in a junkyard," she said, her frown deepening. "Rich Sterling's wife was in town today, talking about the new kitchen they're putting in. Marble countertops." "We don't need marble countertops, Sarah. We have a roof over our heads and food on the table, and it's all ours." She sighed, a long, weary sound. She trusted me, but she heard the talk in town. She saw the new pickups and the fancy clothes. She knew we were falling behind in the eyes of the world. "Just be careful, Jed. Don't pour good money after bad into that thing." I nodded. "I won't." That winter was one of the coldest I can remember. The snow came early and stayed late, burying the fields in a deep, silent blanket of white. For me, the machine shed became my sanctuary. Every night after chores, and all day on the weekends, I worked on the Versatile. The first order of business was that Cummins 55, the triple nickel. I drained the oil and it came out thick and black as tar, with a worrying metallic sheen to it. That wasn't a good sign. I spent a week just cleaning. I scraped off decades of caked-on grease and dirt, revealing the engine block. I disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harness, the drive shaft. Using a chain hoist hung from the main beam of the shed, I carefully lifted the massive V8 engine out of the frame. It swung there in the cold air, a giant greasy heart waiting for a transplant. The teardown was slow, methodical work. I laid each piece out on a clean workbench in the exact order it came off. The heads came off first, then the oil pan. Just as I'd feared, the bearings on the number 3 and 4 connecting rods were shot. Scored and pitted, they'd been chewed up by dirty oil and thousands of hours of hard labor. The crankshaft itself had some scoring. It was salvageable, but it would need to be turned. The nearest machine shop that could handle a diesel crank that big was in Des Moines, a 2-hour drive away. I loaded the heavy crankshaft into the back of my Ford pickup and made the trip. The heater in the old truck fighting a losing battle against the cold. The machinist, a grizzled old man named Gus, who smelled of cutting oil and cigars, looked at the crank and whistled. "Cummins triple nickel," he said, running a calloused finger over the scored journal. "Haven't seen one of these in a while. They're good engines, but thirsty. We can turn it 10,000ths under for you, but it'll cost you. And finding undersized bearings for this old girl might be a trick. It cost me $200 for the machine work, nearly a quarter of what I'd paid for the whole tractor." Sourcing the bearings was another nightmare. I spent hours on the phone calling every parts supplier and salvage yard in a 3-state radius. Finally, I found a set at a truck salvage yard in Omaha. They were new old stock, still in their dusty cardboard boxes. Another $100 gone. While the crank was at the shop, I turned my attention to the rest of the machine. The center pivot point, the big hinge that allowed the tractor to articulate, was sloppy. The pins and bushings were worn egg-shaped. I knew a new set from Versatile, if they even still made them, would cost a fortune. So I did what my father had taught me to do. I made my own. I bought a length of hardened steel round stock and spent 3 days on my metal lathe, turning it down to the precise dimensions I needed, cutting grease grooves into the new pins. I pressed out the old, worn bushings with a hydraulic press and a lot of sweat, then carefully pressed the new ones in. It was slow, painstaking work. My hands were perpetually stained with grease, my knuckles raw and bleeding from slipped wrenches. More than once, I'd come in late at night, so tired I could barely eat, and fall into bed smelling of diesel fuel and metal filings. The ridicule from the community was constant. When I went to the co-op for feed, Rich Sterling would make a show of asking for a progress report on the rust bucket. His cronies would snicker. The talk at the coffee shop was that Jed Stone had finally lost his mind, that he was trying to build a tractor out of scrap iron while the rest of the world was passing him by. They didn't understand. They saw an old man's folly. I saw a path to independence. Every part I fabricated, every bearing I replaced myself, was one less dollar I had to borrow, one less bit of control I was giving up to a banker. By late February, the engine was back together. The reground crank was nestled in its new bearings, torqued to spec. I'd honed the cylinders, installed new rings on the pistons, and lapped the valves. I painted the engine block the proper Cummins beige, a small point of pride in the midst of the overwhelming rust. With the help of my neighbor, a quiet old farmer named Earl who minded his own business, we lowered the engine back into the frame. The moment of truth came on a cold, clear morning in early March. I'd connected the fuel lines, bled the injectors, and hooked up a fresh, heavy-duty battery. I climbed up into the simple metal seat, the cold of it seeping right through my overalls. I took a deep breath, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The big engine turned over slowly at first, groaning against the cold, thick oil. 1 revolution, 2, 3. A puff of white smoke coughed from one of the exhaust stacks. I kept my thumb on the button. Then a chug, a sputter, and with a thunderous roar, the Cummins V8 roared to life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet idle like Rich's new International. It was a rough, guttural, angry sound, a bellow that shook the entire machine shed. Black smoke poured from the stacks before settling into a steady, hazy grey rhythm. The sound of 8.5 liters of raw mechanical power. I let it warm up, my eyes scanning the oil pressure and temperature gauges I'd installed. Everything was holding steady. I eased the clutch in, a heavy manly pedal that took real leg strength, and shifted the big transmission into first gear. The tractor lurched forward, rolling out of the shed and into the weak March sunlight for the first time in nearly a year. I drove it around the farmstead, the roar of the engine echoing off the barn. The steering was heavy, the ride was rough, but it was alive. It was working. Sarah came out onto the porch again, this time with a small smile on her face. She couldn't deny the sound of that engine. It was the sound of power, of potential. It was the sound of a promise kept. The 1970s had truly begun, and with them came an economic shift that no one saw coming. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a massive grain shortfall, secretly negotiated a deal to buy nearly a quarter of the entire US wheat crop. Overnight, grain prices shot through the roof. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent shockwaves through the farm belt. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a way of life, it was a gold rush. The banks, flush with cash and encouraged by the government, opened the floodgates. They were practically begging farmers to take out loans. Get big or get out became the mantra, echoed from the pages of farm journals to the loan offices of the Farmers' Trust. Land prices exploded. A man could buy a piece of ground, and 6 months later, it would be worth 50% more. It felt like the good times would never end. Richard Sterling was the poster boy for this new era of agricultural ambition. He used his soaring profits not to pay down his existing debt, but as collateral to borrow even more. He bought the 200 acres bordering his farm to the west, paying a price per acre that made old-timers shake their heads in disbelief. To work this new ground, his 1466 was no longer enough. He traded it in for a brand-new Steiger Panther II, a green monster of a 4-wheel drive with jewels all around, a quiet, air-conditioned cab, and an 8-track tape player. It cost him over $75,000, a sum that was almost unimaginable to me. He also bought a new John Deere 7700 turbo combine, another marvel of modern engineering that could harvest 8 rows of corn at a time. Rich was the king of the county. His operation was a showcase. His fields were perfectly planted, his harvests were massive, and his line of new green and red machinery was the envy of everyone. When he drove his new Lincoln Continental into town, people would stop and stare. He was the living embodiment of the new American farmer, aggressive, expansive, and deeply, profoundly in debt. He and his wife finally built their new house, a sprawling ranch-style home with a 3-car garage and, yes, marble countertops in the kitchen. He would often see me in my fields and stop his pickup on the road. "Jed," he'd yell over the roar of my old Versatile, "you're still messing with that relic? You could be farming another 300 acres with a new machine. You're missing the boat." I'd just wave and keep going. The Versatile wasn't pretty, but it was powerful. It pulled my 7-bottom plow through the heavy clay soil without a problem. It never broke down in a way I couldn't fix myself with a wrench and some ingenuity. The Cummins was thirsty, just as the machinist had warned, but diesel was still relatively cheap, and the work it did was worth the fuel. The profits from those boom years were intoxicating. In 1974, I had the best year of my life. The combination of perfect weather and high prices left me with more cash than I'd ever seen. Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table one night, looking at the deposit slip from the co-op. It was enough to change our lives. "We could add on to the house," Sarah said, her voice full of hope. "Put in a new bathroom, maybe get some new furniture. We could buy that 40 acres south of here that old man Hemmings wants to sell," I countered, the temptation pulling at me. We talked late into the night. The pressure to expand, to keep up, was immense. Every farmer I knew was doing it. They were leveraging their assets, betting that the good times would keep rolling forever. But something held me back. My father's voice echoed in my head, a constant warning from the grave. "Debt is a cruel master, son. It eats when you're hungry and sleeps when you're tired." Instead of buying more land or a new tractor, I did something that was almost unheard of in those days. I took a massive chunk of our profits and made a lump sum payment on our mortgage. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, looked at me over his spectacles as if I had 2 heads. "Jed, this is a substantial payment," he said, tapping the check with his pen. "Are you sure you wouldn't rather use this as a down payment on the Hemmings place? We could finance the rest at a very attractive rate. Land values are only going up." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "I'd rather own a small farm free and clear than be a tenant on a large one that belongs to the bank." Abernathy shrugged and stamped my paperwork. He saw me as a small-timer, a man without vision. He was lavishing his attention on men like Rich Sterling, who were borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars and were considered the pillars of the community. We did make some improvements. I bought Sarah a new Maytag washer and dryer, and we put a new roof on the barn. I also invested in my own farm, not by expanding, but by improving what I had. I spent money on tile drainage for a low-lying 20-acre patch, improving its yield potential for years to come. I built a new grain bin, allowing me to store my corn and sell it in the spring when prices were typically higher, instead of being forced to sell right off the combine at harvest time. These were quiet, unglamorous investments. They didn't come with the thrill of a new tractor or the prestige of more land. To my neighbors, it looked like I was standing still, a fool letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass him by. My rusted Versatile chugging away in the fields became a symbol of my stubborn, old-fashioned ways. By 1978, the boom was still going strong, but there were whispers of trouble on the horizon. The news on the radio started talking about inflation. The price of everything was going up: fuel, fertilizer, seed, parts. The Federal Reserve was making noises about raising interest rates to cool things down. One afternoon, I was at the parts store picking up a new set of fuel filters for the Versatile when Rich Sterling came in. He was complaining loudly to the man behind the counter about the price of a new set of tires for his Steiger. "It's criminal what they're charging," he fumed, "and the interest rate on my operating loan just went up another 0.5 point. Abernathy says it's temporary." I paid for my filters and left quietly. But his words stuck with me. Temporary, that's what they always say right before the storm hits. That fall, as I finished my harvest, I made my final mortgage payment. The farm was ours, free and clear. Sarah and I celebrated with a simple dinner, a sense of profound relief washing over us. We had a small savings in the bank, our equipment was old but sound, and we owed nothing to anyone. Across the road, the lights of Rich Sterling's massive new house blazed against the twilight. I could hear the faint sound of his new grain dryer running, a constant, expensive roar that would continue day and night for weeks. He had harvested thousands of bushels more than I had, from land that was mortgaged at 10% interest, with equipment that was financed at 12%, all funded by an operating loan that was now creeping toward 15%. He was standing on the top of a mountain, but the mountain was made of debt. And down below, the ground was beginning to shake. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper on the wind. It was the summer of 1980, and the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey plate. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high and rustling with life, stood stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The air grew thick with dust, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything and worked its way into your teeth. My old Versatile seemed to feel the heat as much as I did. The big Cummins engine ran hot, the temperature needle creeping steadily toward the red. I had to stop every few hours of cultivation to let it cool, sitting in the meager shade of the machine, drinking lukewarm water from a thermos and watching the heat shimmer rise from the fields. It was slow, frustrating work, but the tractor kept running. It was during one of those breaks that I saw Rich Sterling's Steiger Panther stop dead in the middle of the field across the road. It was a magnificent machine, fully enclosed in an air-conditioned cab, a bubble of modern comfort against the brutal heat. But now it was silent. I watched as Rich got out, his face red with anger, and kicked one of the massive dual tires. He stalked around the tractor, then threw his hat on the ground in disgust. Later that day, the dealer's service truck was out there, a sure sign of a serious and expensive problem. The word at the co-op the next morning was that the Steiger's sophisticated electronic transmission controller had fried. It was a sealed unit, a black box of circuits and wires that no local mechanic could touch. A new one had to be ordered from the factory in Fargo at a cost of $3,000, and it would take a week to get there. A week of lost time in a season where every day mattered. I saw Rich at the parts counter, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a tight, worried look. He nodded curtly at me, avoiding eye contact. He was buying a case of hydraulic fluid. "Trouble with the Panther?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He grunted. "Just a little electrical gremlin. These new machines are so complex." He said it as if complexity were a virtue, but his tone betrayed him. The magic was failing. The drought was only the beginning. In January, the government announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. It was meant to be a political statement, a punishment for their actions in Afghanistan. For us, it was a catastrophe. The market, which had been built on massive export sales, collapsed overnight. Corn prices plummeted from $3 a bushel to less than $2. The foundation of the farming boom crumbled away. The combination of a disastrously small harvest, due to the drought and rock-bottom prices, was a brutal 1-2 punch. For me, it was a terrible year. My savings took a hit, and there would be no improvements made around the farm. But because I had no debt, I could absorb the loss. I tightened my belt, deferred buying new tires for the truck, and told Sarah we'd have to make do. We survived. For Rich Sterling, it was the beginning of the end. He had enormous loan payments to make, calculated on the expectation of $3 corn and 200 bushel an acre yields. With a 100-bushel yield and sub-$2 corn, the math was impossible. He didn't just have a bad year, he had a catastrophic shortfall, a hole so deep he couldn't see the bottom. The bank, which had been so eager to lend him money, was suddenly cold and clinical. Mr. Abernathy was no longer talking about attractive rates, he was talking about payment schedules and collateral. Rich had to take out another loan, a short-term, high-interest note, just to cover the operating loan from the previous year. He was borrowing money to pay back borrowed money, a death spiral that every farmer feared. The cracks in his empire began to show. One of his hired men was let go. The fields he'd bought at the peak of the market looked ragged the next spring. He was cutting back on fertilizer to save money, a desperate gamble that would only hurt his yields further. The shine was gone from his equipment, replaced by a film of dust and neglect. One afternoon in late spring, he pulled his pickup into my lane. It was the first time he had ever come to my farm. He got out slowly, a different man from the one who had mocked me at the Miller auction years ago. His confidence was gone, replaced by a weary desperation. "Jed," he said, not meeting my eyes. I need a favor." I waited. "The main hydraulic pump on my John Deere planter went out," he said, his voice low. "Dealer wants a fortune for a new one, and I'm a week out from getting it. I'm already behind on planting. I heard you had an old Deere planter in the back of your shed. I was wondering, could I borrow the pump off it? I'll pay you for it, of course." I looked at him, at the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped. This was a man drowning, and he was grasping for anything that would float. The planter he was talking about was a 6-row model I hadn't used in years, but I kept it for parts. "Let's go take a look," I said. We walked to the old shed. The pump was greasy and coated in dust, but it was sound. It took us an hour of wrestling with rusty bolts and stiff hoses to get it off. I handed it to him. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, pulling out his wallet. "Nothing," I said. "Just bring it back when you're done with it." He stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and shame. "Jed, thank you." "We're neighbors, Rich," I said, turning to walk back to the house. "That's what neighbors do." He stood there for a long time, holding that old, greasy hydraulic pump, a small, simple part from a machine I owned outright, a lifeline he desperately needed to keep his vast, complex and mortgaged operation from sinking. The tide had turned. The rust bucket was starting to look like a life raft. The early 1980s descended on the heartland like a plague. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against runaway inflation, cranked interest rates to levels that were simply unimaginable. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, climbed to 15, then 18, then over 20%. For farmers like Rich Sterling, who were carrying massive variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. Every month, the letters from the Farmers Trust Bank arrived, each one announcing a higher payment, another turn of the screw. At the same time, land values, which had been the bedrock of all that borrowing, collapsed. Ground that had sold for $3,000 an acre in 1979 was now struggling to fetch $1,000. Farmers who had been millionaires on paper suddenly found themselves insolvent, their debts far exceeding their assets. The phrase "farm crisis" was on the news every night. Black and white photos of grim-faced families standing in front of foreclosed farmhouses filled the papers. It was the Great Depression all over again, but this time it was happening in slow motion, a quiet, grinding despair that settled over the countryside. The auction notices started appearing in the local paper like obituaries. First it was the younger guys, the ones who had jumped in at the peak of the market. Then it was established, multi-generational farms, families who had worked the same land for 100 years, now being forced out by a combination of bad luck and bad debt. The weekly livestock auction became a grim marketplace for used farm equipment, as desperate men tried to sell off a tractor or a plow to raise enough cash to hold off the bank for another month. I saw Rich less and less. When I did see him in town, he looked haunted. He'd lost weight, and his eyes had a hollow, defeated look. The new Lincoln was gone, replaced by an old, beat-up Chevy sedan. The talk in the coffee shop was that he was in deep, that the bank was about to foreclose. His wife had taken a job as a clerk at the grocery store to help make ends meet. The marble countertops in their new house must have felt as cold as a tombstone. My life, in contrast, was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. It wasn't easy. My income was down, and my costs were up. But my discipline in the good years was paying off now. The farm was mine. The tractors were mine. The only man I had to answer to was myself. My old, simple machines became my greatest assets. When a bearing went out on the Versatile's axle, I didn't have to call a dealer. I went to the bearing supply store, paid $30 in cash for a new one, and spent an afternoon installing it myself. My Gleaner E combine, slow and small by modern standards, was a marvel of reliability. It had no complex electronics, no hydrostatic drive to fail. It was just chains, belts, and pulleys, all things I could understand and fix. While my neighbor's giant, computerized machines sat idle, waiting for expensive parts, I just kept harvesting. The inevitable finally happened in the fall of 1982. A notice was posted on the courthouse door and printed in the paper. The assets of Sterling Farms, Incorporated, would be sold at public auction by order of the Farmers Trust Bank. The list of equipment was staggering: the Steiger Panther II, the John Deere 7700 combine, a fleet of tractors, plows, planters, and trucks. And at the end of the list, the land itself, 1,000 acres, to be sold in separate parcels. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect match for the mood. The crowd was huge, but it was a quiet, somber gathering. It wasn't like the Miller sale. There was no sense of opportunity, only a profound sadness. These were Rich's friends and neighbors, come to watch the dismemberment of a man's life. Rich was there, standing beside his wife near the half-empty machine shed. He looked like a ghost, his face pale and drawn. He tried to hold his head high, but the shame was a physical weight, bowing his shoulders. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, was there too, looking uncomfortable in his city suit and overcoat. He avoided eye contact with the local farmers, speaking only to the auctioneer. He was just doing his job, but to us, he was the executioner. They sold the equipment first. The magnificent Steiger, which had cost Rich over $75,000 just a few years earlier, sold for $20,000. The combine, barely broken in, went for a third of its original price. It was a bloodbath. The market was flooded with used equipment from failed farms, and the prices were abysmal. I watched as Rich's dream was dismantled piece by piece, each crack of the gavel another nail in the coffin of the life he had built. I didn't bid on any of it. I didn't need it, and it felt wrong, like picking over a corpse. I was there for the land, specifically the original 80-acre parcel that had been the Sterling family's home farm for 3 generations, the one with the old barn and the grove of oak trees where Rich had grown up. When the auctioneer started on the land, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the final act. I stood my ground, my heart pounding in my chest. I had my life savings in a cashier's check in my pocket. It wasn't a lot, but in this market it might be enough. The bidding was slow, hesitant. No one had any money. An out-of-state investment group made a lowball offer. I countered. They raised. I raised again. We went back and forth, the price creeping up slowly. Finally, the bidding stalled. The auctioneer looked at me, then at the investor's representative. "Going once," he called out, his voice echoing in the cold air. "Going twice." I saw Rich look over at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sold." The gavel fell, to Jedediah Stone. I had just bought the heart of my rival's farm. A heavy silence settled as the auctioneer moved on to the next parcel. The out-of-state investors, unopposed, bought up the rest of the 1,000 acres for a fraction of what Rich had paid. The Sterling farm, as a working entity, was gone forever. As the crowd began to break up, I saw Sarah walking toward me, her face a mixture of pride and concern. She took my hand, her grip tight. "You did the right thing, Jed," she whispered. I walked across the trampled yard, past the men from the bank who were already putting padlocks on the shed doors. I found Rich standing alone by the old barn, his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground his great-grandfather had first ploughed. His wife was a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself as if to keep from falling apart. He looked up as I approached. I expected anger, resentment, maybe even hatred. Instead, his face was just empty. "You," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why?" "It's good land, Rich," I said quietly. "It shouldn't be owned by a company in Chicago. It should be farmed by someone who understands it." He gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Someone like me, you mean? Look where my understanding got me. I lost everything." "You didn't lose everything," I said. "You lost the debt. You lost the pressure. You lost the banker's phone calls in the middle of the night." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "I'm going to need some help working that piece of ground next spring. I'm not as young as I used to be. I was thinking I'd need to hire a good man, someone who knows that soil better than anyone." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He understood what I was offering. It wasn't charity, it was a job. It was a chance to stay on the land, to work the soil that was in his blood, to earn a wage without the crushing weight of ownership and debt. It was a chance to reclaim his dignity. Tears welled in his eyes, the first I had ever seen from him. He didn't try to hide them, he just nodded, unable to speak. He looked past me, his gaze falling on the rusted, faded form of my versatile 145, which I had driven over and parked along the lane. That old tractor, the symbol of everything he had once mocked, now represented the very thing that had saved me and, in a strange way, was now offering him a second chance. It was a monument to a different kind of wisdom, a quiet testament to the idea that the race isn't always won by the swift, but sometimes by the steady, the patient, and the free. The years that followed were a time of healing for the land and for the people. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the community. Many families had been lost, their names vanishing from the mailboxes at the end of long gravel lanes. But those who survived, like me, emerged with a new and profound respect for the old ways. The mantra of "get big or get out" was dead, replaced by a cautious, more sustainable philosophy. Rich came to work for me that next spring. It was awkward at first. The unspoken history hung in the air between us. But the hard work of farming has a way of smoothing out such things. We fixed fences together, we sorted cattle, and when it came time for spring tillage, he climbed up into the open-air seat of the old Versatile. I saw him run his hand over the faded paint on the fender before he fired up the engine. The guttural roar of the Cummins V8 echoed across the valley, a familiar sound of power and endurance. He was a good man to have. He knew every dip and swell of that 80 acres, every spot where the clay was heavy or the soil turned to sand. He worked with a quiet intensity, a man humbled but not broken. There was no more talk of $60,000 profits or marble countertops. We talked about the weather, the price of seed, and the best way to fix a leaking hydraulic line. We became friends. The community's perception of me had changed completely. I was no longer Jedediah Stone, the eccentric old fool with his junkyard tractor. I was Jed, the man who had seen the storm coming, the one who had weathered it by sticking to his principles. Younger farmers, the ones just starting out, would stop by the shed, asking for advice. "How'd you do it, Jed?" one of them asked me one day, looking around at my collection of old, well-maintained equipment. "How'd you survive when so many others went under?" I wiped the grease from my hands with a rag and leaned against the massive front tire of the Versatile. "It's simple, really," I told him. "I only ever bought what I could afford. I learned the difference between an asset and a liability. This tractor," I said, patting the rusty hood, "it's an asset. It makes me money. A brand new one with a 20% loan attached to it. That's a liability. It owns you. You don't own it. Don't ever let your ambition write a check that your character can't cash." Sarah and I lived out our years on that farm in peace and contentment. We never got rich, not in the way Rich Sterling had once been. We never built a new house or took fancy vacations. But we had something more valuable: security. We owned our lives. Every evening we'd sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the fields, our fields, and feel a profound sense of gratitude. One crisp autumn evening, years later, my grandson, a boy of 10 with my same stubborn chin, was with me in the machine shed. He was watching me grease the pivot point on the Versatile, the same pins and bushings I had machined by hand all those winters ago. The tractor was even more faded now, its red paint almost gone in places, but the engine fired up on the second or third turn, every time. "Grandpa," he asked, his voice full of a boy's curiosity, "why do you keep this old tractor? It's so rusty." "Dad says we could get a new one now." I stopped turning the grease gun and looked at him. I saw the future in his eyes, the pull of the new, the shiny, the modern. I knelt down so I was at his level. "This tractor is more than just a machine, son," I said, my voice soft. "This tractor is a story. It's a story about the value of things that last. It's about being able to fix what's broken with your own two hands. It's about the difference between looking rich and being rich." I put my hand on his small shoulder. "See, there was a time when everyone was buying big, fancy new things they couldn't afford. They laughed at this old tractor. They said it was junk. But when the hard times came, their fancy machines were hauled away by the bank. And this old thing," I patted the fender again, the steel solid and cool beneath my palm, "this old thing just kept on working. It doesn't have a radio or air conditioning, but it's honest, and it's ours. It reminds me that the strongest things in this world aren't always the prettiest." He looked from my face to the old tractor, his young mind processing the weight of my words. He reached out and put his own small hand on the rusted fender right next to mine. In that moment, I knew the lesson had been passed on. The legacy wasn't in the land or the money. It was in the wisdom earned through hardship, a wisdom as simple, as durable, and as powerful as the old iron machine that stood silent and faithful in the fading light.